I'll call this meeting to order of the Polk County Board of Commissioners. Today is Tuesday, December 12th. Please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Are there any comments for items not on the agenda today? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve the minutes of December 5th?
So move.
Second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye, motion carries. Next up, we have Jody Merritt and Dave Guile here to present the Polk County Equity Action Plan. Please join us.
Good morning.
Good morning.
1,000 years baseball.
Oh, Phil. Look what's happening.
I mean, he buys drinks.
Good.
The press is here too. They just saw that.
All right, so good morning. So I am here basically just to introduce Dave and this project. Back in 22, towards the end of 22, the Criminal Justice Commission issued a grant project, which was attached to justice reinvestment. The purpose was capacity building, really focusing on an equity action plan or expanding current equity work that was happening within the community. Through the LIPSIC and the Board of Commissioners yourselves, we had agreed to apply for the grant to focus on an equity action plan. And so we were awarded that grant October, November of 22, and then immediately jumped in with Dave to start that work. So really, he's the champion of that work. We worked very closely through all of this and very pleased with the outcome to really kind of focus moving forward. So Dave is here to present.
Or prevent? No,
Present.
I hope I don't
apologize.
prevent any.
Present.
Good morning, commissioners. Thanks for having us here today. I've got some slides that I'll walk through, just kind of an overview of the grant and what the outcomes were, what the significant findings were. And at the end, there's an 8-step action plan that we're recommending. So if you have questions as we go, that's fine, or questions at the end, be happy to answer those too. When the grant was written, there were 2 main goals identified, and they're up on the screen. And one is essentially to gather information from the clients, so those people on parole and probation, and then also from justice partners and the corrections folks that work in Polk County. And the other then was to essentially assess what's working, what isn't working, and try and look at characteristics. Now, when the grants were given out by the state, really a lot of this came from the Multnomah County area, so that a lot of equity issues around race and gender, those kinds of things were real prevalent in what they were looking for. Polk County is not as diverse as Multnomah County or Washington County. So the diversity pieces in this really weren't going to play out as well, just because you don't have the numbers to justify that. And so when Brent and Jody and I got together and talked about it, one of the things we talked about was barriers, that one of the big issues might be barriers. So as you'll see when we get into some of the data, we really were looking about, are there factors that affect the clients on parole and probation that have to do with barriers, as well as are there equity issues in it? And then really the outcome is is number 3 up there, which is have an action plan. So what? So you gather all this data, then what? And so I'll walk you through some of the demographics, and these aren't very big on the screen, but do you all have copies of it? Okay,
You got them here.
okay, so you've got, so we looked at, and what this will show you is we looked at, male and female. And one of the things is a large proportion, as you might expect, of the clients are males. In fact, it's like 80% are males. And yet in the survey of the people who responded, so we had 114 people who took the survey who were clients, and that was a little more weighted for females. So more females actually participate in the survey, and it's voluntary to do. Pretty good return on the survey overall, 24%. Usually when we do community-based surveys, if you can reach 20%, that's considered significant. If you can get to 30%, that's really good. We're kind of right in between those. So not bad. And then you can look at the age group comparisons up there too. Pretty good representation, a little bit light on the 18 to 30. 37% of the caseload is in that 18 to 30 group, but it wasn't as high on the survey. So fewer of those of that age group category participated. And then down at the bottom, you can see, so these are the racial breakdowns. And, it looks in this like, Native American, especially at 10%, that would seem pretty high, or to race. But really, we're talking about pretty small numbers here. So on the caseload, there were actually 14 people who identified as American Indian, Native Alaskan. So 14 people. Out of those, 11 participated in the survey. So, that's a good response of that group. But that elevated their part of the survey total to 10%. But we're really talking again about pretty small numbers. And that same thing is true for people who identified for to race or more. Now, over 80% of the clientele of corrections are white, and yet the total is 72%. So essentially they were a little bit underrepresented. So I like to include this kind of information so somebody doesn't get real hung up on, oh, wow, 10% of Native American, Native Alaskans had a feeling. Unless you really know the numbers behind that, you got to be a little careful not to go too far down that pathway. And all of this data is, Jody's got it in a set of charts, and it's in the full report. Some of it, there's a ton more. But you could look at it there if you would want. And then we looked at things like employment, and you can see that unemployed is almost 40% of the survey respondents were unemployed. That's a pretty high number. You can look at the education level. Those are probably pretty well balanced. Over 50% had at least graduated high school, and then another almost 35% or 30% went on beyond high school. So that's pretty good. And then not very many veterans are on the caseload, 11% of the survey's respondents. Do they have family in Polk County? The vast majority do have family here, which is certainly an important factor for corrections people working with the clients, is whether or not they have family that can be supportive. And then how do they get around? Only 47% have their own car. That is an issue for the corrections officers because it's difficult for some of these people to come in for their appointments. And so for the corrections officers, figuring out how am I going to meet with that person? Is a virtual meeting good enough? There are issues around that. And then where do they live? There are about 20% of the ones who took the survey were unhoused. And I know Polk County is looking at that issue, not just for corrections people, but for others too. And so then, in the whole big report, what's the input demographics? Well, all 9 of the corrections officers participated. All 3 of the administrators participated. The client survey, as I mentioned, was 114. I did a focus group with three people who had graduated from parole and probation. I wanted to see what their perspectives were on what was working and what wasn't working. In the report, that's all done just with comments. We didn't survey them, so their data isn't in that way, but their comments are very interesting. And I'll get to a couple of those further on. Law enforcement leaders, I did individual interviews, 3 of those, and then 26 justice partner respondents participated in a survey, and you can see that breakdown. So 1 was a volunteer, that represents 4%. 1 was private business, the majority law enforcement, 1 judicial person, 3 county employees that were not part of corrections, some people that were part of corrections, but not one of the officers, and then a city employee. So the data includes their comments and what they thought was working or think is working or not working. So in the report, what we did in each section was we came up with key findings. So in the barriers section, so instead of taking you through all the data, these are the key ones. Stress was huge to the clients. 36% of them said it's number 1, just the personal stress. However, what was interesting was the officers in corrections had that as their 9th highest. And so one of the things that, is important for the corrections administrators to work through with their staff is, how are you assessing the stress of your clients to have those conversations? And a lot of them do. It may just need to be refocused on. I'm not suggesting it isn't touched on, but wow, that was huge to the clients. Housing and access to transportation were the next 2 highest, and they were the highest for the officers too. They thought transportation and housing were huge for the clients. The cost of basic necessities was huge to the clients, but it was the 10th highest rated one to the officers. And when you read through the comments, that's one of the things that the clients talked about was, if I just had money to get my driver's license, if I just had money to buy these things for my kids. So there are issues around the cost of things and whether or not they have the resources to give them. Mental health need did tie for first by the officers, but it was interesting because the clients didn't have that as high, but it may be because the clients who participated in the survey are not necessarily the ones who have the mental health needs. In fact, that would have been if we had a way to assess that, that would have been interesting. Access to drug and alcohol was 4th highest by the officers. And again, that wasn't rated as high by the clients. Doesn't mean it wasn't important, but it wasn't in their top 5 for sure. And then employment was high, especially for the Hispanic clients and those of 2 or more races. So in terms of barriers, and those probably are not way different than we've asked about barriers when we did the community health survey, when we worked with other groups who tried to assess barriers, and those line up pretty well with what we've seen from other surveys.
Can I burrow down in a couple of your points here?
Sure.
So your last 2 bullets,
Yep.
First one, access to drugs and alcohol. So what does that really mean by the officers?
So
Does it mean they have too much access?
what it meant was, yes, that the availability of drugs and alcohol, and the clients talked about that in their comments more. In fact, in the focus group, that was with the the graduates. One of them said, the toughest time for me is 2 o'clock in the morning because I know where I can go to get drugs. I don't know where I can go to get help at 2 o'clock in the morning. So that's a big issue.
And then the access to drug and alcohol treatment is, to your point you made last there, was they don't know where they can get treatment at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
I'm guessing, indicating a 10th highest by clients, meaning that's not their priority.
It wasn't their priority. And again, it's a question of, did the people who take the survey, they're less likely to be in that group? Possible.
Good.
You know, I don't know that for sure. And unless we went deeper with individual clients, just don't know. that.
Yeah, I think that's an important caveat to add probably
Yeah.
to most of these questions is that it depends on who you're asking.
Exactly.
And you don't know if who you're asking actually had an experience that would apply to the question.
Yeah.
And then the employment, was there any way to work down into the employment question about why they thought that employment was a high barrier?
We would have to do that in a focus group.
Okay,
or
so you don't have
interviews.
anything.
We really didn't, other than the graduate ones, that those were face to face. You know, and they talked about employment, although none of those people were in the Hispanic group. There were people who were not white in that group, but they weren't Hispanic. So you're right. Yeah, we would have to go.
So let me be
deep.
clear on this. You're telling me that non-Hispanics answered that question?
Everybody answered that question, but the group that rated it highest was the Hispanic client group.
So Dave,
Yeah.
on your ethnic groups, a couple screens back, you never mentioned Hispanics.
It's
And here
because how the state does it and how corrections does it are different. So, you know, probably from any form you've filled out, it will ask you, are you white, Latino? Yeah, okay, so that's one way to look at it. Another way then is to separate Hispanic as a complete distinct category. And so, and you'll see it in the report, I talk about that. There's a discrepancy between how the state reports people and how corrections report people. Because in the state, it is combined within the question in the way corrections does it, and that's statewide, how they collect it. It's, you're either this or this, you can't be both. So the data isn't perfectly clean on that issue. So when you look through the report, you'll see that. And I was surprised that it was different too.
And
Clarifying question on the drug and alcohol. So we did not ask respondents if they had drug or alcohol issues.
Background, no, we
Okay.
did not ask that. We really didn't think we had the leeway to go very far into any medical, mental health, drug and alcohol issues. You know, with me, I'm not an employee of the county. I'm not a health professional. We would have had to do something to get permission for them to divulge that information. Is how I was feeling about it at the time. So.
Makes sense.
And just one clarifying piece. So the correction system is still the DOS-based black screen, green writing. And so we don't have the capability of collecting anything because we rely on the system that's been in place since the 1970s. So,
It's very outdated.
yes,
Yeah.
Lots of Hispanic folks who identify as white or.
Yeah.
we don't have the ability to separate those in our system. So the information I provided him is different than what the state of Oregon collects as far as demographics.
Yeah. So in the areas of resources, programs, services, and safety, some of these will sound redundant because in the first part, we're talking about barriers in this part of the survey. And in the groups, we're talking about, you know, resources and how do you get stuff. So the clients picked the housing, financial help, finding resources, transportation, those were the highest. And one of the questions we did ask is how do you even find out about those things in Polk County? And the things that came up, and these are in order of frequency. Parole officers was their first source of information. Social media, interestingly, was second. And then Family and Community Outreach Department, and then other Polk County offices like behavioral health came up. And so those were how they know, oh yeah, I could go here to get this kind of help. officers and administrators in their surveys all recognized essentially those same kinds of ones and added in the Recovery Outreach Community Center. Over 70% of the clients said, hey, yeah, I feel safe and I'm fairly treated in Polk County. About 10% said no, they don't feel safe, and about 10% not fairly treated. And this is where that breakdown for the American Indian Native Alaskan plays in, because there was a significant difference, about 20-point percentage difference in how they felt about safety in Polk County. And you'll see when we get to the action plan that we try and address some of that. And then a higher percentage also of that same group said they didn't feel treated as fair. Now, total caseload for that group is 14, 11 people on this survey. So we're not talking about giant number here, but significant enough difference to at least note it and, see whether or not needs some further action down the road. Before I jump off of this, any questions? If we're okay here. Okay. So client perceptions of the department itself, community corrections, 96% of the clients felt, hey, yeah, my officer listens to me, they understand me. 87% felt their concerns were at least somewhat addressed. The American Indian Native Alaskan felt a little less sure about that. There was about a 10% difference, especially about whether or not people understood their background. Not huge, but again, worth noting. Between 82% and 92% of each different cultural group said they had some or a lot of input into their own particular case plan. So that was good, that's strong. And then 91% to 100% of each one said, oh yeah, I have enough time with my officer to be able to talk about my concerns. So really pretty good feelings about community corrections. I was thinking maybe the sanctions one, when they get a sanction from either the court or community corrections, they might feel negative about, but actually they didn't, and there weren't significant differences. So in terms of equity, where these grants originally started, if you're looking for some big red flags, this is where you would probably look, and we just didn't find any big red flags here. So that's a good thing, I think. And then we asked a question, we asked this of every group, all the focus groups, survey groups, everything is, do you think there's any disparity in how clients are treated based on things other than the actual facts of the case? So if the facts of their case is different, then yeah, the treatment or the outcomes might be different. When we asked that, about 30% of the clients in their written comments identified a disparate condition. And the most frequently identified ones were either race, gender, or do they have connections in the community? And that could be positive or negative, that difference. So what the comments say is, hey, if I'm connected in the community, if I know people, if I know how to access things, I'm going to get a better outcome or better treatment than if I don't. And people who said they didn't have that said, yeah, I don't even know where to get this. So there was a feeling that there is some difference there, especially on the community connections one.
Are we able to unpack that a little bit? Was it simply that they have a better support system and that's just generally leads to better outcome, or is it connections within the public safety community, individuals working in there? Or
I would, when I read that, when I read the various comments, I would say it would be connections to the power bases.
Okay.
Who do I go to if I'm struggling with rent? Who's got control of that or knows about that? It was more like, if you're well connected, if you know who to talk to, then you've got a better chance of getting better treatment. That's how I read them.
Yeah.
And their comments are in the report. So you'll be able to look at some of those. But again, remember, we're dealing with total of the clients, 114. So about 25% of the total clients. And we have to be careful. And one of the things I always worry about these things, because it's a public document. Now, somebody goes in and cherry picks one or two of those comments and says, oh yeah, that's what it means in Polk County. No, that isn't what it means in Polk County. What it means is those two people felt that way. Now, if there's enough of those people who feel that way, then yeah, that's worth looking at.
So one of the recommendations is to conduct some of this over time. So we can
Exactly.
get a longitudinal picture.
That is one of the action plan items. That
We'll let you continue, sorry.
Yep.
Let's go ahead, Craig.
However,
Yes, jump in.
my challenge always is, so what's the rest of the community feel?
Yeah, true.
And so what's the baseline of our population feel about that question?
Yeah.
And again, if you're gonna try to find the best equity path, then you have to look at the bigger picture
Yeah.
across the entire community, because somebody who's encountered correction systems challenges
Mhm.
likely a different outcome or different attitude than the balance of the community.
Yeah.
I know I would answer this question quite differently.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So, I always want to I know that wasn't in the scope, but, I always want to be able to help avoid the cherry picking issue.
Yeah.
But concur that, perhaps going further and exploring that more, might be worthwhile.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I think if there was a broader community survey and you could weave some of these things in, that would be absolutely great data to have.
Yeah.
For you as leaders in the county, I think that would be great. So about 30% of the officers, essentially identified race and gender as ones. They didn't really talk about the community connections one. But obviously those can be a factor. And then with the administrators, when I did the interviews with them, they thought that the client's background, that if people know the client's background, that sometimes that could put a flavor on it. And I know even with my interviews with the justice partners, one of the things they talked about was that they can have a law enforcement person driving down the street and see one of the parolees associating with a group of people they shouldn't be associating with anymore. And that flavors their response a little bit to, uh-oh, that person's out there with that group again. That's who they got in trouble with before. Is that a danger sign? But I don't think you can probably do anything about that. I mean, that's just normal, perception of, uh-oh, we could have a problem here again. None of them expressed that any action was taken. They just said when they noticed that, it starts triggering a thought of, do we have a problem starting to build? And then one of the questions we asked is, what else is needed? What do we need? So clients essentially identified the same things as what they had as barriers: the transportation, the housing, employment opportunities, all of those. They were pretty much the same. They did come up with a couple of different ones. One was figuring out a way to fast track probation if a client is really meeting all the requirements and doing a great job with that. Is there a way to fast track that? Know the answer to that?
There is, there's
Okay.
statute around it.
Okay, so that might
Discharge.
be a good enhancement to push that forward a little bit harder. And then they also talked about the ABCs of life after prison, which is when you're in prison, things are so regimented, you don't have to make decisions about stuff. When you're out of prison, you do. And to teach those. Now, I know when I was talking with the officers, we did a follow-up session with the officers after their survey, just to talk about, hey, these are how your responses look. Can you give me any insights to those? And the officers in those conversations essentially talked about this, that, hey, yeah, when I'm working with this client, I've got to help them figure out a way to do whatever. And so I think that occurs, but maybe formalizing that a little bit more might not be a bad thing either. So that one was interesting. The officers had a couple other specific needs. One was addressing male trauma, which maybe Jody can explain this better than me, but they have a sense that the male caseload felt more looked down upon. Is that the right way to say that? Anyway, that it was harder being a male on parole and probation than a female, that they didn't feel they would get as much support. Anyway, it was interesting that came up. And then the officers themselves just saying having a gender responsive caseload, but actually the gender balance in corrections is excellent. You know, it's in fact, if you wanted to do it ideally, you would probably add one more male and one less female, but it's great balance really. And then the administrators talked about, hey, we really need a better communication system, including a better technology dashboard, which Jody's already mentioned, and then figuring out ways to do geographical check-ins and virtual sessions to avoid the transportation issues that clients have.
While also supporting public safety on that. I want to throw that one.
Yeah, make sure you say that.
Yeah.
So that leads us to the action plan then. And so we came up with 8 actions. The first one was continue to do something like this. Do an annual survey, especially with the probation clients and the justice partners, but to Craig's point, maybe broaden it out to the community more, and use that data to compare with what we found out from this year and see, you know, what are the data points? Are we making some progress? Are there areas that are falling off? And so if there's a way to do that, I think that's a great idea. I went to one of Jody's lunch and learn sessions where she has people from the different justice partners come in. They talk about what's going on, and not only in corrections, but
It's just the DA's office.
it's what?
It was just the DA's office.
Oh, anyway, it was just the DA's office. It felt like a whole bunch of people to me. I think doing a broader version of that, a community justice forum once a year, and bring the leaders from every justice partner in, and some of the agency people like behavioral health and family and community outreach, review the data if you've done the survey, and collaboratively plan, what can we do? What more can we do? There's always a little bit more we could do. So that was action 2. 3, strengthen and broaden the links with partners. I think, you know, using Brent's department, their connections with DHS and everybody else, probably some good ways to do that. Expand prevention activities. And then I think looking, and this really is from the client point of view, how do these clients reintegrate into the community? How do they reintegrate with their families? I interviewed one gentleman. His biggest issue was regaining the trust of his family. That, if he could do that, would be huge. Obviously, that takes some agreement with the family to do that too. But I think from his perspective, if he could get that one thing, it probably would make the difference for him and his parole and probation. And then how do you reintegrate? How do you get back in the workforce, and how do you continue to advance within the workforce? Action 4. This one is the one to address the Native American, and is there a male-female difference? So I put in here to have a quarterly focus group that would have one correction administrator, so it could be different each quarter. One corrections officer, again, could be different each quarter, and 6 clients, and it would be one group, a homogeneous group per quarter. So maybe in the fall, you do the Native American group or the Alaska Native American Indian group, and you do that in the fall with the corrections people. and you just discuss these kinds of issues. You know, you dig down into, hey, we see this in the survey, but what's it really mean to you? And dig down on that. And then do one maybe in the winter with fall, with males, or in the winter with males, one in the spring with females, and then people of color really would needs in Polk County be a combined group. There just is not enough. Can't do an Asian group. You really don't have enough Hispanic clients to do a Hispanic group. So I would do probably a people of color group. I think if, you know, something like that happened, then that can feed back into that second action of the community forum or the corrections forum, because then you've got some specific data from each of those groups. So that's a recommendation, really a pretty inexpensive one, because there's really no cost with that other than time. Procure additional training. All of the corrections officer have had some equity training, but certainly there can be more. One of the issues for Polk County is getting somebody to come in and do it. They can virtually do it, but as we all know, face-to-face tends to feel and be a lot better. Kind of hard to get somebody in to come right to Polk County and do that, and there is a cost to that. Action 6, identify the client perceived stressors as a formal part of the corrections intake process. So I know that occurs from talking with the officers and the administrators, that they do talk about it. Formalizing that a little bit more, putting a little more emphasis on it, getting it down in writing in the action and the case plan and those kinds of things, I think would be a good piece of this puzzle. And again, really not any cost other than some time and communication. 7, assess, plan, and budget for equipment and technology upgrades. I'm assuming Polk County is like most government agencies with COVID money going away and things changing with state. This isn't a great time to be going, oh, we can spend another $200,000 to do this. So really, it's going to require some planning and budgeting in the future. And then I think Action 8, looking at what kind of grants might be available, especially from the state. And that's where I think doing a survey like this initially, that opens the door. You know, I think Brent's department has experienced that several times over the last few years, where they had a small grant that opened the door, and then that led to some bigger grants coming in to fund projects. And I think that's the same approach for the corrections department would be a good approach. So with that, I will stop there and we can answer any other questions that you have. I hope we can answer.
Well, I just want to comment, I really appreciate the work. I think this project is worth doing for a number of reasons. Obviously, a successful corrections program means that a high percentage of folks are graduating through the program, which leads to safe, secure, and economically resilient communities. And some of the reentry issues obviously are a bit beyond the scope of corrections, and we don't have a succinct reentry program. But that employment number, the 50% of folks who are unemployed is a big outlier number. And just one comment on the equity issue. I think, you know, people get trapped into the racial categories, but equity could expand to geography, it could expand to age, disability, multiple categories. And I think being cognizant of barriers for folks to reach services, both in corrections and I think countywide, especially the human services oriented programs, is really important. And I think a sign of a healthy organization when we look at that. So I just appreciate the work. I'll pass it on for questions. I have a couple if they're not addressed.
Good.
Good. So in terms of the recommendations, I support all of them. Some of them are dependent on funds, obviously, but it's something to consider. And in terms of the racial categories, we are becoming more diverse. So we aren't currently in this, snapshot of time as diverse as other counties, of course, in terms of racial categories, but it's growing more so. And I think absent some solid data on folks' perceptions, there are culturally responsive best practices that I'm sure you employ to a certain degree, but there's proactive ways to address that. So just wanted to add that. Yeah. Really
And,
appreciate it.
you know, when I reviewed the action items with Dave and that American Indian, the tribal piece really popped out for me because we do have a PO that goes out there to see the clients so that those transportation barriers are mitigated there. So, but that was a concern because we also tap into the tribes' treatment services and their resources. And quite frankly, this basically helps solidify that, probation is trying to be everything for everybody. And that's moved away from the statutory requirement of what community corrections and parole and probation is. And it's a bigger topic, as you know, that's happening worldwide, but ultimately we're resource brokers. We're trying to get them stable so they're not continuing in the criminal justice system. We're trying to protect public safety, but we're also trying to do that with that level of humanity and empathy. And the stress piece I noticed is we have a different lens on it. We're focusing on those key pieces: housing, employment, paying for necessities. Well, if you look at it, that's what stress is. Where am I going to sleep tonight? How am I going to get to work? How am I going to pay for this? That's the stress. And so we look at it differently in a different lens. So this has provided us with an opportunity really to break that down, stop looking at it so clinically, and really trying to engage those conversations more to tap into those resources that we're aware of, or some we're not aware of. There's so many, and we have a general, job to do, but on top of that, we want our clients and the community to thrive. And that's one of our goals, in addition to the underlying we're probation. We need to do all those other things. So, but we try really hard to be clearly everything to everybody. And I mean, I think that we've done a good job with the responses from our clients through the focus groups and whatnot, but we still have work to do. This is just a jumping off point. We are going to be implementing surveys both at intake, mid, probation, and exit, and to try and help with some of these questions, help us do better. I've done a client satisfaction survey previously with what do you think of your PO? Because that helps us really bring in the different training and different information that we need to try and help coach and again support this population.
That number is very high. Your POs are really relating to your clients well.
Yes.
It's gonna maximize success for the client.
And they're doing a great job, but that doesn't mean you take your foot off the pedal. If anything, you try and find additional things that we can do better at, because we want to do what's best for our community, for public safety, and for the clients we serve and our partners. So we're really focused on this. So
going forward, how's your funding look from the state?
the same.
I know
Grace
it's
giggling over there. The same at this point. I do know that our OACCD is asking for a 16 million stopgap funding in the short session. So there is a one pager that will be going out shortly. In addition, we're garnering the support of our Sheriff's Association as well as the DAs, and I believe the Chiefs Association as well, in order to further support that. There's a lot of conversations happening. I was working on it yesterday that one of the senators was asking, why do we pay for housing? Why do we pay for employment services? Why do we do all this extra work, what we're talking about here, being everything to everybody? And so we're really going back, and this is why housing authorities can say, I don't want to house this individual because of their criminal history, or it's too expensive, or there's not enough. So we're really kind of putting together a good framework. And quite frankly, our association hasn't done a really good job of sending our message. And so there's a great deal of passion behind that right now because of the recent reduction in funding. And I want to be clear, that reduction in funding also was tied to Measure 110, also tied to the cost study that we have done for years that is never fully recognized or funded. What we do, we don't get paid for adequately. And so we're really pushing back on that as an association moving forward. That's all we have right now.
The Senate Bill 1145 we're part of is looking at the funding scheme beyond, for the next biennium. Hopefully good recommendations will come out of that. It's a pretty diverse group in terms of focus areas, but really the AOC, Association of Oregon Counties, message is we need, in order to even continue services, we need higher funding levels at that formula level. So
And consistency.
and consistency, being able to predict.
Yeah, because that's a difficult piece. Every 2 years, as you know, we wait until July to figure out what community corrections budget is, and it fluctuates. There's no true baseline of costs like you would here with what Greg does with our budget. Here's your employee costs, here's your costs to keep your lights on, your administrative costs. This is your baseline of costs. And then you have the extra. What extra do you have that you can pay for programs, services, innovation? We don't have that baseline of this is the employee administrative cost. It's all based off of per head on supervision. It's all a per capita rate based off of the number of people on supervision in the state. And then based off of our population, we get a percentage of that. So it's extremely volatile. So we're building programs, we're tearing them down, we're hiring people, we're laying them off. And as you know, it takes a minimum of 18 months to fully hire, train a new probation officer or law enforcement officer, quite frankly. So we're hoping out of this 1145 group that there would be some type of, I don't want to say baseline because that's attached to something else, but
True to cost.
true to cost. Yeah.
And what we're seeing too statewide, I think here too, is that the severity of need for the clients has increased per capita. So the formula is really out of step with what is actually being done on that. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainty with what will happen with the Measure 110 response. If we reintroduce some misdemeanors for drug possession, for example, that will really affect our, Jody's workload. So how do we make sure that's funded? Lots of unknowns at this.
What kind of judicial system weigh in this survey?
So the survey, the partners were sent the survey, and it was sent out twice, and it was sent to the judicial, all the judges, all the emails that I had, and one person from judicial waited. So.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Dave, Jody.
You're welcome.
I think that's yours.
No, I have one.
All right, one, it was on the counter.
Oh, right. Just in case you need that.
Okay.
Good discussion. Are there any non-listed items anybody would like to address before we consider an executive session? I believe we have an executive session today. So we'll recess for executive session.
Recommend a recess until 10:30, at which point the board can convene an executive session pursuant to ORS 192-660 sub 2H to consult with counsel concerning the legal rights and duties of a public body with regard to current litigation or litigation like to be filed.
Okay.